It's Friday. Appreciate you joining us as we bring our studies to a close this week. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I'd like to read those last few verses again, make a few more points about them. So, verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. And I know this is a hard chapter because he says earlier, flee idolatry. Don't play around with it, but here it is. Here's what has to be considered. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's in all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's in all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And then chapter 11 begins with, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. As he denied himself for others, so Paul is denying himself for others, and he's calling on the Corinthians to do the same thing. Now, to look at this passage, the verses that we just read, what points can we make? One is this. He says, eat. Eat whatever is sold in the marketplace. Have faith. He's just said, an idol's not anything. That's what he said. An idol's nothing. The food that's sacrificed to idols, it's nothing. It's not like the food itself. It's not like the food itself is defiled. It's just food. So eat. Have faith. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he does. This is what he's talking about. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market. Don't ask questions about it. Just eat. Okay? But now he puts out a scenario there. If anyone who does not believe invites you to dinner and you desire to go, eat. Again, don't ask any questions for conscience sake. But if someone says to you this was offered to idols, well then don't eat for the sake of the one who told you. All right, back to our points. Eat and have faith. Why is that okay? Because this meat was undoubtedly sacrificed to idols. That's what this was. Okay, that's where this meat came from. Well, why is it okay? And this is the Lord's point. The reason that it's okay is because of verse 28. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. That meat, whatever it may be, it doesn't belong to Aphrodite. That meat doesn't belong to Apollos. That meat doesn't belong to Diana. Diana, Apollos, Aphrodite, and any of the other gods or goddesses, they did not create that animal. They did not create those things that God has given us for us to receive with thanksgiving. Those things aren't God. Those things do not belong to those false gods. Those things belong to Jehovah God. God created those things through Jesus. This is why it's okay. That meat is not defiled. The earth and all of its fullness is God's. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. So that's why it's okay to eat. The Lord has created these things for us to receive. So, eat, ask no questions. Have faith, and it's okay. Ask no questions. Now, do all these things to the glory of God. And this is the problem that the Gentiles were not doing, that a lot of them weren't doing. Apparently, of course, they were sacrificing, and they were giving thanks to false gods. But he talks about in the passage, and he says, if I partake with thanks, and he talks about giving thanks for his food. And whether you eat or drink. And verse 31, I think, is just look at the language. Therefore, whether you eat or drink. What that means is whether you eat or drink or whether you choose not to. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Do it to the glory of God or don't do it to the glory of God. If you're not able to handle this yet, okay. So he's trying to teach him, he's trying to come along, but he's saying whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. If you eat, give thanks. If you don't eat, give thanks to God. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So, back to our points. I think something shows up here, and I think it's the hypercritical. Should look back at this passage. Because he's talking about unbelievers in verse 27. Someone who does not believe invites you to dinner. Now, if they say something, well, that's one thing. He says if somebody says something that this was sacrificed to idols, don't eat it. You need to think about their conscience. But I think it's verse 29 where we start getting into it. The hypercritical. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? I don't think whoever's doing the judging in verse 29, I don't think that's talking about the unbeliever. I don't think. Verse 30, but if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? I didn't look it up, but I want to look it up. That verse, I want to see what the other translations say about that. New American Standard, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered about that for which I give thanks? You understand what was happening? Paul probably would not have cared about if outsiders slandered him, if unbelievers slandered him. He's talking about those in the church, is what he's talking about. So what it starts getting to is the hypercritical. And this is what he says. The unbelievers, they don't know. They don't know. The unbeliever, if they say something, if they say this was sacrificed to idols, and they think it's an idol, and they don't know. They're unbelievers. They don't get it. But who is it who's slandering Paul? Is it the unbelievers? Or is it some of those folks in the church? Who was it who was judging Paul, as he speaks about earlier? Who was it to the point where, where was it? This is chapter 9 at verse 3. My defense to those who examine me is this. Someone's got a bone to pick with Paul. And I'm not saying it's a justifiable bone to pick. That's the point of this verse. He says, if I give thanks to God, why am I being slandered about this? Unbelievers don't know any better, but believers should. Christians should. Christians should understand those idols aren't anything. That food is not defiled. Food is just food. It neither commends or does not commend us to God. It's just food. But if I give thanks to God, I'm not giving thanks to Aphrodite. I'm not worshiping Aphrodite. I'm not worshiping Apollos. I'm not doing those things. I am giving thanks to God for my food. Why am I being slandered by these folks? Why is my liberty being judged? Because the moment you start judging liberties is the moment where you have to be resisted. You have to be resisted. And I think that's what Paul's doing here. Do not judge my liberty in this. And I'll tell you right now, I don't think I had seen this when we were going through the earlier chapters, but it is a monumental point. We see it very clearly in talking about Titus and circumcision. And Paul says, they did not yield for a moment when those folks who spied out their liberty, when they were trying to bind what God has not bound. We see it real clearly in that instance where Paul says, we didn't yield for a minute. He's talking about the same thing here when he says, why am I being slandered about this? This isn't the unbelievers. These are the believers. and they are slandering me because I'm exercising a liberty. They're trying to bind what God has not bound. Now, I understand, and I've said it, I mentioned in previous chapters, this is a hard one for me because he still says flee from idolatry. Don't play around with it. But this business with the meat being sold in the marketplace, before I get there, he says, I do not want you to, let me get back over there. Let me kick back to the New King James. He says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake the Lord's table and the table of demons. So, this business that was happening, you better be real careful. But he says, even there, he says, I'm not saying an idol is anything or what is offered to an idol is anything. This business up here is not talking about, it's not about food. It's about fellowship and it's about worship. Well, this business down here, if he gives thanks to God, the food is just food. Why am I being slandered about this? Stop binding what God has not bound. Stop being hypercritical in these matters. We just have to be careful. And he was being slandered, and we'll say this, because he's rebuking them. And rebuking people's not wrong. Hopefully that goes without saying, but I said it anyway. If you rebuke me, you better have your Bible in hand, and you better show me in Scripture that I've done something wrong. Because if this is just your opinion, nope. If this is you trying to bind something that God has not bound, nope. You don't get to judge in matters of liberty, either pro or con, either for or against. You don't get to bind what God has not bound. And Paul says, if I'm giving thanks to God for this, what's the problem? What's the problem? And they were being hypercritical. They had an issue with Paul, and they needed to, as he says in another place, if anyone is spiritual, let me read it. I think it's towards tail end of chapter 3. If anyone seems so, oh, I'm thinking of another verse. I'll have to hunt for it. But if anyone was spiritual, they needed to acknowledge that the things Paul said were from the Lord. Paul was not just shooting from the hip at all. And that's what they needed to recognize. And in slandering Paul, they were trying to bind what God had not bound. They were being hypercritical. Anyway, got to be careful. So, he says, eat, have faith. These things, God has made this food. God has made these animals. All the earth belongs to the Lord. Do it to the glory of God. But then he brings in that other issue. And I think that might be one of the bigger issues. So, hope the study's been helpful for you as we've gone through chapter 10. Hope you've had a good week, and hope you have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday. Thanks for being with us today.